Rain hammered the gravel drive as a carriage rolled to a stop before Ashworth Hall, and inside it sat a young woman clutching a leather satchel of books as if her life depended on keeping them dry. She had traveled 3 days to reach this house, and she had no idea that within hours, a single careless sentence would set her on a collision course with the most powerful man in the county. Her name was Eleanor Whitmore, and she was 24 years old, the daughter of a scholar who had spent his life teaching Latin and Greek to boys who would never appreciate what he gave them. When her father died the previous winter, Eleanor had been left with little money but an education few women of her time possessed. A letter from Lady Cecilia Ashworth, the Duke's younger sister, had arrived like a lifeline, offering her a position as a private tutor. Eleanor had accepted without hesitation, packed everything she owned into 2 trunks, and set off for a house she had never seen, to serve a family she had never met. She stepped down from the carriage into the rain, her boots sinking slightly into the wet gravel, and looked up at the enormous stone face of Ashworth Hall. Windows glowed with candlelight on every floor. Servants moved briskly across the courtyard, carrying trays and baskets, shouting instructions to one another over the noise of the storm. Somewhere inside, a string quartet was tuning their instruments, and the smell of roasting meat drifted out through an open kitchen door. It was clear that something important was happening that night, though Eleanor did not yet know what. She had no way of knowing that the Duke of Ashworth, Edmund, was hosting a reception for members of the royal court, and that his household had been thrown into a frenzy of preparation since dawn. She had no way of knowing that in a few hours, he was expected to deliver a formal address in Latin before some of the most educated men and women in the kingdom, a speech he had written himself, certain of his own brilliance. And she certainly had no way of knowing that her arrival, on this exact evening, would collide with his overconfidence in a way neither of them could have predicted. Eleanor gathered her satchel and approached the side entrance, where a line of servants hurried in and out with linens and silverware. She had been told in Lady Cecilia's letter to present herself at the main door and ask for the housekeeper, but the chaos of the evening made it impossible to find anyone willing to stop and listen. She stood at the edge of the courtyard for a long moment, rain soaking through her cloak, uncertain where to go. That was when the Duke saw her. Edmund Ashworth came striding out of the side entrance with his valet trailing behind him, adjusting his cravat, his mind entirely occupied with the speech he would deliver that night. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of easy confidence that came from a lifetime of never being questioned. He had inherited his title at 26, along with more land than he could ride across in a week, and in the 8 years since, he had grown accustomed to being obeyed the instant he spoke. He did not consider himself unkind. He simply did not consider most people at all. His eyes swept across the courtyard and landed on Eleanor, standing alone near the servants' entrance in a plain gray traveling dress, her hair damp and coming loose from its pins, a worn satchel clutched to her chest. To him, she looked exactly like every other young woman employed in his household to fetch, carry, and clean. He did not pause to wonder why she was standing so still, or why she carried books instead of linens, or why her posture was so straight despite the exhaustion clearly written on her face. "You there?" he called out, not unkindly, but with the flat certainty of a man giving an order rather than making a request. "I need my blue coat brought down from my chambers immediately, and someone must see that the west drawing-room is aired before the guests arrive. The smell of smoke is still lingering from this afternoon. See to it at once." Eleanor blinked at him through the rain, momentarily too startled to respond. She opened her mouth to explain that she was not a servant, that she had just arrived, that she was here to tutor his sister in Latin and rhetoric, not to fetch coats or air out drawing rooms. But before she could speak, the Duke had already turned away, moving toward the front steps with the assured stride of a man who never doubted that his instructions would be carried out. For a moment, Eleanor simply stood there, rain dripping from the edge of her hood, feeling something hot and sharp rise in her chest. She was not accustomed to being spoken to that way. Her father had raised her to believe that her mind was her greatest possession, that the ability to read Cicero in the original Latin and debate the finer points of classical rhetoric made her the equal of any nobleman in the kingdom, regardless of what her bank account said. And yet here she was, mistaken for a servant within her first 5 minutes on the Ashworth estate, dismissed with a wave of a hand by a man who had not even bothered to look at her twice. She could have called after him. She could have said, "Forgive me, Your Grace, but I am not one of your household staff. I am Eleanor Whitmore, and I believe your sister is expecting me." It would have been the simple thing to do, the sensible thing, the thing that would have spared her the indignity of what came next. But something in her hesitated. Perhaps it was exhaustion after 3 days of travel. Perhaps it was simple shock at being addressed so carelessly. Or perhaps, in some part of her mind, she did not yet fully understand. She wanted to see exactly how far this man's arrogance would carry him before the truth caught up with him. A young footman hurrying past with an armful of candles noticed her standing frozen in the rain and slowed his steps. His name was Arthur, and he had worked at Ashworth Hall since he was a boy of 14, long enough to have learned every hallway and every one of the Duke's moods. "You'll catch your death standing out here, miss," he said, not unkindly. "Are you lost? The kitchen entrance is just there if you're looking for Mrs. Hollies." "I was told to ask for the housekeeper," Eleanor said, finding her voice at last, though it came out quieter than she intended. "I am expected here. Lady Cecilia sent for me." Arthur's eyebrows rose slightly, curiosity flickering across his face, but a bell rang somewhere behind him, urgent and demanding, and he winced. "That'll be Mrs. Hollies now, ringing for candles. Come along, miss, I'll take you to her myself. Can't have you standing out here catching cold before you've even started." He led her through a side door into a narrow corridor thick with the smells of beeswax polish and roasting meat, past a blur of moving bodies, footmen and maids rushing in every direction with the particular urgency of a household bracing for important guests. Eleanor followed him closely, still holding her satchel against her chest, feeling entirely out of place amid the organized chaos. They found Mrs. Hollies in the servants' hall, a stout woman with sharp eyes and a voice that carried effortlessly over the noise around her. She was directing 2 maids on the placement of fresh flowers when Arthur brought Eleanor forward. "This young lady says she's expected, ma'am," Arthur said. "Says Lady Cecilia sent for her." Mrs. Hollies turned, taking in Eleanor's damp traveling dress and the satchel of books with a quick, assessing glance. For a moment, her expression was unreadable, and Eleanor felt a fresh wave of worry that perhaps there had been some mistake, that her letter had been lost, that she had traveled 3 days for nothing. Then Mrs. Hollies' face changed entirely. "Miss Whitmore," she said, her voice suddenly warm with relief. "Oh, thank heavens! We had feared the storm might delay you another day, and Lady Cecilia has been asking after you since morning. Come, come, you must be exhausted. Arthur, fetch some tea to the blue sitting room at once, and have someone bring Miss Whitmore's trunks up from the carriage." The transformation in the housekeeper's manner was so sudden that Eleanor almost laughed with the relief of it. Here, finally, was someone who knew who she was, who had been waiting for her, who understood that she was not simply another pair of hands to be ordered about the house. And yet, even as relief flooded through her, the memory of the Duke's dismissive command lingered like a splinter beneath her skin. "Fetch my coat. See to the drawing-room. At once." Mrs. Hollies led her through the servants' corridors and up a narrow back staircase, chatting warmly about the household as they went, about Lady Cecilia's eagerness to begin her studies, about the grandeur of the estate, about the importance of the evening's gathering. Eleanor listened with half her attention, the other half still turning over the encounter in the courtyard, replaying the Duke's face, his voice, the careless certainty with which he had assumed her role in his household without a single question. "Forgive me for asking," Eleanor said finally as they climbed the stairs, "but is that the Duke I saw outside just now, the tall gentleman coming from the side entrance?" "That would be his Grace, yes," Mrs. Hollies said, a note of pride entering her voice despite herself. "You'll meet him properly this evening, I expect, at the reception. A fine man, the Duke, though he does have his ways, very sure of himself if you understand my meaning. Comes from having everyone agree with him since he was in short trousers, I always say." She laughed softly, then seemed to catch herself, glancing back at Eleanor with mild embarrassment at having spoken so freely. Pay no mind to an old woman's chatter, miss. You'll find your own opinion of him soon enough, I'm sure. Elinor said nothing, but she filed the words away carefully, very sure of himself. She had already gathered as much. They reached the blue sitting room, a bright, elegant space with tall windows overlooking the gardens, and Mrs. Hollis left her there with promises of tea and dry clothes, and an introduction to Lady Cecilia within the hour. Alone at last, Elinor set down her satchel and sank into a chair by the window, watching the rain streak down the glass, her thoughts churning. She thought of her father, of the long evenings they had spent together after her mother's death, him reading aloud from Virgil while she followed along in her own copy, correcting his occasional deliberate mistakes just to prove she was paying attention. He had always told her that knowledge was the one possession no one could take from her, that a woman who could think clearly and argue well would never truly be powerless, no matter what the world assumed of her at first glance. She thought of the Duke's face in the rain, the easy assumption in his eyes, the complete absence of curiosity about who she might actually be. He had looked at her and seen nothing but a uniform she was not even wearing. A knock came at the door, and a young maid entered with a tray of tea and a plate of small cakes, along with a note in elegant handwriting. Elinor opened it to find a warm welcome from Lady Cecilia herself, expressing delight at her arrival and promising to visit as soon as her duties allowed, given the demands of the evening's reception. The note ended with a small postscript that made Elinor smile despite everything. "I do hope you will join us this evening, Miss Whitmore, if you are not too weary from your journey. My brother has been rehearsing a Latin address for weeks and insists it is flawless. I confess I would very much like a second opinion from someone who might actually know." Elinor read the line twice, and something in her chest loosened slightly, replaced by a small, sharp flicker of interest. A Latin address. Flawless, he insisted. She thought again of the Duke's face, his easy confidence, the certainty with which he issued commands to a woman he had not bothered to truly see. She did not yet know exactly what the evening held. She did not know that within hours she would stand in a room full of the kingdom's most powerful people, and watch that same confidence falter in front of everyone he most wanted to impress. She did not know that her own voice, calm and clear, would be the one to catch him when he fell. But as she sat in the warm glow of the blue sitting room, sipping tea and watching rain slide down the tall windows, Elinor Whitmore allowed herself, for the first time since the carriage had stopped in the courtyard, a small and private smile. Whatever happened tonight, she thought, the Duke of Ashworth was about to learn that not everyone he dismissed with a wave of his hand would stay silent forever. Outside, the rain began to ease, and somewhere below in the great house, the sound of instruments being tuned drifted up through the corridors, mingling with the low hum of servants finishing their final preparations. The evening had not yet truly begun, but already the pieces were moving into place, quietly, invisibly, the way the most important collisions in life so often do, long before anyone realizes a collision is coming at all. Elinor changed into a dry dress from her trunk, a simple gown of deep green wool, the finest thing she owned, and sat by the window brushing the tangles from her hair while the house around her hummed with preparation. She could hear footsteps in the corridor outside, hurried and constant, and every so often a voice rose above the general murmur, someone calling for more candles, someone else asking whether the wine had been brought up from the cellar. The reception was still hours away, but already the household moved as though the guests might arrive at any moment. She thought she might be left alone until evening, but barely half an hour had passed before the door opened, and a young woman swept in, bright-eyed and eager, wearing a gown of pale yellow silk that suited her fair complexion perfectly. This was Lady Cecilia Ashworth, 17 years old, with none of her brother's guarded confidence and all of the restless curiosity of someone who had spent her whole life surrounded by books. She was told she need not read too closely. "Miss Whitmore," Cecilia said, crossing the room with both hands extended, "I am so glad you have finally arrived. I have been counting the days since Mrs. Perrin at the Academy recommended you to me. She said you read Cicero the way most people read a novel, purely for pleasure, and I confess I did not entirely believe her. Elena rose and took the offered hands, startled by the warmth of the greeting after the coldness of her arrival. "I hope I will not disappoint you, my lady." "Cecilia, please. We shall be spending far too many hours together over Latin verbs for such formality." Cecilia settled into the chair across from her, tucking her feet beneath her skirts with the unguarded ease of someone still young enough to forget she was supposed to behave like a lady at all times. "Tell me honestly, did the journey exhaust you terribly? The roads from the academy are dreadful this time of year, all mud and ruts." I begged Edmund to send a better carriage, but he was far too occupied with his speech to think of anything else this week. At the mention of her brother, Elena felt the memory of the courtyard rise again, sharp and unwelcome. She hesitated, unsure whether to mention the encounter at all, but something in Cecilia's open, curious face made her decide honesty was the better course. "I believe I may have already met your brother in a manner of speaking," Elena said carefully, "though I do not think he realized who I was." Cecilia's eyebrows lifted with interest. "Oh, do tell." Elena recounted the scene in the courtyard, the rain, the satchel of books clutched against her chest, the Duke's brisk instructions about the blue coat and the drawing room, delivered without so much as a pause to ask her name. She tried to keep her tone light, amused rather than wounded, but something of the sting must have shown through, because Cecilia's expression shifted from delight to mild horror partway through the telling. "Oh, Elena, I am so terribly sorry," Cecilia said, using her given name without seeming to notice the slip. "That is exactly the sort of thing Edmund would do. He does not mean unkindness by it, truly he does not, but he has never once in his life had to consider that a person standing before him might not be exactly who he assumes them to be. He looks at the world and sees precisely what he expects to see, and it rarely occurs to him that he might be wrong." "It is no matter," Elena said, though privately she was not entirely certain that was true. "I did not correct him. I confess I was too startled to find the words in time, and then he had already gone." "You should have told him," Cecilia said, though her eyes were bright with something closer to amusement than reproach. "Oh, I would give a great deal to have seen his face when he learns the truth. He does so hate being wrong about anything, and he is wrong so rarely that he has quite lost the habit of noticing when it happens." Elena felt a small, unexpected laugh escape her. "Perhaps it is better this way. Let him discover it in his own time." "Perhaps," Cecilia said, though her tone suggested she found the idea far more entertaining than diplomatic. She leaned forward, lowering her voice as though sharing a great secret. "Do you know, he has been working on his address for the reception tonight for nearly 3 weeks. He insists it is the finest piece of Latin oratory ever composed by an Englishman, and he has refused to let anyone read it beforehand, not even our aunt, who studied under a proper tutor in her youth, and knows more Latin than half the men who will be in that room tonight. He says he wishes to surprise everyone with his brilliance." "And does he often surprise people with his brilliance?" Elena asked, unable to keep a note of dry curiosity from her voice. Cecilia laughed outright at that, a bright, unguarded sound. "He surprises people with his confidence, certainly. Whether the two are always the same thing I could not say. I have heard him practicing through the study door these past few evenings, and I will admit, some of the phrases sounded a bit peculiar to my ear, though I am hardly qualified to judge. That is precisely why I wrote to you, Miss Whitmore. I want to be able to judge such things for myself one day, and not simply take a man's word for his own brilliance because he says it with enough confidence." There was something in the way Cecilia said this, a quiet seriousness beneath the playful tone, that made Elena look at her more closely. She saw, then, that this was not simply a wealthy young woman indulging a passing fancy for education. There was real hunger in her eyes, the same hunger Elena recognized from her own reflection in her father's study, late at night, working through a difficult passage by candlelight because she could not bear to leave it unsolved until morning. "Then we shall begin properly tomorrow," Elena said, "and I promise you, my lady, you will learn to judge such things for yourself, and to trust your own ear over anyone's confidence, however grand." Cecilia beamed at her, and for a moment the tension of the day's earlier humiliation eased entirely from Alina's shoulders. They spent the next hour in easy conversation, Cecilia asking eager questions about which text they might begin with, whether Alina preferred Ovid or Virgil, whether it was true that she had once corrected a visiting scholar's translation of a Horace ode in front of an entire lecture hall. Alina admitted with some embarrassment that the story was true, though it had not been quite so dramatic as the version that had apparently traveled all the way to Cecilia's academy. As the afternoon wore into evening, a maid arrived to help Cecilia dress for the reception, and Alina found herself once again alone in the blue sitting room, this time with a far lighter heart than before. She had come to Ashworth Hall expecting isolation, another household where her intelligence would be tolerated rather than valued. Instead, she had found, in Cecilia, something closer to a kindred spirit, and the discovery warmed her more than she had expected. But as the hour of the reception drew nearer, and the sounds of arriving carriages began to echo up from the courtyard below, the memory of the Duke's dismissive command returned to sit uneasily in her chest. She thought of what Cecilia had said, that he hated being wrong, that he had lost the habit of noticing when it happened. She thought of the address he had been rehearsing for 3 weeks, refusing to let anyone check it, so certain of his own brilliance that he had not thought to ask for a second opinion. A knock came at the door, and Mrs. Hollis appeared, carrying a fresh gown over one arm, midnight blue with a modest neckline, clearly one of Lady Cecilia's own dresses, altered slightly to fit. "Lady Cecilia insists you must attend the reception tonight, miss," Mrs. Hollis said, laying the gown carefully across the bed. "She says you are to be introduced as her tutor properly before the whole gathering, so there can be no more confusion about who you are in this house." Alina ran her fingers over the fine fabric, feeling a flutter of nerves she had not expected. She had attended small gatherings before, academic dinners where scholars debated points of grammar over roast fowl, but nothing on the scale of a royal reception, with dukes and diplomats and members of the court all gathered beneath one roof. "Does the Duke know I have been invited?" she asked. Mrs. Hollis's mouth twitched with something that might have been suppressed amusement. "I could not say what his Grace knows, miss. He has been shut up in his study all afternoon with his notes, muttering to himself in Latin loud enough to be heard clear down the hall. I dare say he has given very little thought to anything beyond his own speech." Alina allowed herself a small, private smile at that. "Then I suppose we shall simply have to see what he makes of the evening." As Mrs. Hollis helped her into the blue gown, fastening the small row of buttons along the back, Alina caught her own reflection in the tall mirror standing in the corner of the room. She looked, she thought, entirely unlike the damp, disheveled traveler who had stumbled into the courtyard that afternoon. Her hair had been carefully arranged, her dress fit well despite the hasty alterations, and there was a color in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the cold rain and everything to do with anticipation. She thought again of the Duke's careless words in the courtyard, "Fetch my coat, at once." She thought of Cecilia's description of a man who had never once had to consider that a person before him might not be exactly who he assumed. And she thought, with a small thrill she did not entirely examine too closely, of the flawless Latin address he had spent 3 weeks perfecting, certain that no one in that grand room would dare to question a single word of it. Downstairs, the sound of the string quartet swelled as more guests arrived, carriages rolling up the drive one after another, their lamps glowing gold against the darkening evening. Somewhere among them, diplomats and courtiers straightened their coats and rehearsed their pleasantries, entirely unaware that the evening ahead of them would not unfold quite the way anyone expected. Alina smoothed the front of her borrowed gown, took a steadying breath, and turned toward the door. Whatever came next, she told herself, she would meet it standing tall, exactly as her father had taught her. And this time, if the Duke of Ashworth looked at her without truly seeing her, she would not let the moment pass in silence again. She followed Mrs. Hollis out into the corridor, toward the sound of music and candlelight and the low, growing murmur of 100 important voices, and somewhere beneath the nervous flutter in her chest, a small, steady certainty had begun to settle. Tonight, One way or another, the truth of who she was would no longer belong to her alone. The great hall of Ashworth Hall had been transformed for the evening into something out of a painting, tall candelabra lining the walls, their light catching on crystal glasses and polished silver, the string quartet playing softly from a raised platform near the far windows. Guests moved through the space in clusters of silk and velvet, their voices blending into a low, constant murmur punctuated by occasional laughter. Elinor paused at the entrance, momentarily overwhelmed by the sheer scale of it, the sense that every person in that room belonged to a world entirely separate from the one she had grown up in. She spotted Cecilia almost immediately, standing near the center of the room in a gown of soft rose silk, speaking animatedly with an older woman whose sharp eyes and elegant posture suggested she missed very little. Cecilia caught sight of Elinor and waved her over with unrestrained enthusiasm that made several nearby guests turn to look. "Miss Whitmore, there you are," Cecilia said, drawing Elinor into the small circle. "Aunt Margaret, this is the tutor I wrote to you about, the one Mrs. Perrin recommended so highly, Miss Elinor Whitmore." The older woman, who Elinor now understood to be Lady Margaret, the Duke's aunt, studied her with frank, assessing interest. "Ah, the Latin prodigy. Cecilia has spoken of little else for weeks. Tell me, Miss Whitmore, is it true you once corrected Professor Whitfield's translation of Horace in front of an entire lecture hall of Cambridge men?" Elinor felt a flush of embarrassment creep up her neck. "I fear the story has grown somewhat in the telling, my lady. I simply noted that his rendering of a particular ablative absolute changed the meaning of the line rather significantly. I did not intend to embarrass him." "Intended or not, embarrassed he was, I have no doubt," Lady Margaret said, a glint of dry amusement in her eyes. "I have met Professor Whitfield, a man entirely too pleased with his own cleverness. I should have liked to see his face." She studied Elinor a moment longer, then added, more quietly, "You will find a similar sort of man in this house tonight, Miss Whitmore, though I trust you will exercise rather more diplomacy with him than you apparently did with the professor." Before Elinor could ask what she meant, a ripple of movement passed through the room, heads turning toward the grand staircase at the far end of the hall. Elinor followed the direction of every gaze and saw him descending the steps with the unhurried confidence of a man entirely accustomed to being watched. Edmund Ashworth had changed since the courtyard, of course, dressed now in formal evening clothes of deep charcoal that made him look taller still, his dark hair combed neatly back, a folded sheet of paper visible in one hand, tucked against a small leather notebook. He moved through the crowd with easy grace, pausing to exchange greetings, clasping hands, inclining his head to various dignitaries who bowed in return. He looked, Elinor thought, entirely at home in his own grandeur, a man who had never once questioned his place at the center of every room he entered. "There he is," Cecilia murmured, leaning close to Elinor's ear. "Watch his face when he sees you. I have been waiting all evening for this." Elinor felt her pulse quicken, though she could not have said whether it was nerves or something closer to anticipation. She watched as the Duke made his way steadily toward their small group, greeting Lady Margaret with genuine warmth, kissing his sister's cheek affectionately, and then turning, at last, toward Elinor. For a moment his eyes passed over her the way they might pass over any unfamiliar guest, polite but unfocused. Then something shifted, a small crease appearing between his brows, a flicker of recognition slowly resolving into confusion. "Forgive me," he said slowly, "have we met? You look remarkably familiar, though I cannot place." "We have met, Your Grace," Elinor said, keeping her voice steady and pleasant, though she felt Cecilia practically vibrating with suppressed delight beside her. "Earlier this afternoon in the courtyard in the rain. You asked me to fetch your blue coat and see to the airing of the west drawing-room." The change in his expression was immediate and unmistakable. His eyes widened slightly, color rising faintly along his jaw, and for one brief, satisfying moment, the effortless confidence that had defined every movement of his descent down the staircase faltered entirely. "You are the young woman from the courtyard," he said, his voice carrying a note of genuine astonishment. I had assumed you were one of the new kitchen staff, brought on for the evening. So I gathered, Your Grace, Elinor said, and though she kept her tone carefully neutral, she could not entirely suppress the small, dry edge that crept into her words. I am afraid I was somewhat too startled at the time to correct the misunderstanding. Cecilia, no longer able to contain herself, stepped forward with obvious delight. Edmund, allow me to properly introduce Miss Elinor Whitmore, my new tutor in Latin and rhetoric, whom I have been expecting for nearly a fortnight. The very woman Mrs. Perrin recommended so highly, whose scholarship you dismissed as kitchen staff not 4 hours ago. A ripple of quiet laughter passed through the small group gathered around them, Lady Margaret pressing a gloved hand to her mouth to hide her amusement, several nearby guests who had caught fragments of the exchanging glances of their own. The Duke's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, though to his credit, he did not attempt to deny the truth of it or brush the moment aside with false charm. Miss Whitmore, he said, recovering himself with visible effort, inclining his head toward her with what looked like genuine, if somewhat strained, courtesy. I owe you an apology. My conduct this afternoon was unforgivably careless, and I hope you will accept my sincere regret for the discourtesy. Elinor studied him for a moment, weighing her response. She could sense that the entire small gathering was watching to see how she would answer, whether she would accept the apology graciously or press the advantage further while she had it. She thought of her father's voice, patient and steady, reminding her that dignity was worth more than the satisfaction of a well-aimed rebuke. Apology accepted, Your Grace, she said simply. I imagine a man with as many guests to attend to as you had this afternoon might be forgiven a moment's inattention. Something in his expression shifted at that, a flicker of surprise, perhaps even respect, at the graciousness of her answer when he had clearly braced himself for something sharper. You are generous, he said, more generous than I likely deserve. Perhaps, Elinor allowed, and this time she permitted herself the smallest hint of a smile. Though I confess I shall be curious to see whether your Latin this evening proves as flawless as your sister assures me you believe it to be. The words landed exactly as she intended, and she watched the Duke's expression flicker again, this time with something closer to wariness. Cecilia let out a small, delighted laugh, quickly disguised as a cough, while Lady Margaret's eyes gleamed with unmistakable interest. My sister exaggerates my confidence, the Duke said, though the slight edge in his voice suggested Cecilia's assessment had not been far from the mark. I have simply prepared carefully, as any host would wish to, for an occasion of this importance. Of course, Elinor said, I meant no criticism, Your Grace. I have not yet heard a single word of your address. I could hardly judge its merits in advance. No, he agreed slowly, studying her with new attention now, as though reassessing something he had failed to notice before. I suppose you could not. He paused, and for a moment something almost curious entered his expression, a flicker of the same quality Elinor had glimpsed in his sister, a genuine interest in a mind he had not expected to encounter. You are a scholar of Latin, then, truly, and not merely as a fashionable accomplishment for a young lady's education. My father taught rhetoric and classical languages for 30 years, Elinor said. I do not know how to separate my love of Latin from my love of him. It has simply always been part of how I understand the world. Something in her answer seemed to catch him off guard, a brief softening around his eyes that vanished almost as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the careful composure expected of a man in his position, surrounded by watching guests. Then, I shall look forward to hearing your honest opinion of my address tonight, Miss Whitmore, whatever that opinion may turn out to be. I shall give it honestly, Your Grace, Elinor said. I promise you nothing less. A servant appeared at the Duke's elbow just then, murmuring something about the arrival of a foreign envoy requiring immediate greeting, and with a final, measured nod toward Elinor, the Duke excused himself and moved back into the crowd, his composure largely restored but something in his bearing subtly altered, less certain than it had been moments before. The instant he was out of earshot, Cecilia seized Elinor's arm with barely contained glee. Oh, that was even better than I imagined. Did you see his face? I have never once seen my brother apologize to anyone so quickly, or look so thoroughly unsettled while doing it. I did not mean to unsettle him, Elinor said, though the small smile still tugging at her mouth suggested she was not entirely displeased with the outcome. Nonsense, Lady Margaret interjected, fixing Elinor with a look of frank approval. A man like my nephew needs unsettling from time to time, Miss Whitmore. It is good for his character. I dare say this evening has only just begun to prove interesting. Elinor glanced across the room to where the Duke stood greeting the foreign envoy, his profile sharp and composed in the candlelight, the folded pages of his speech still tucked carefully against his side. She thought of the confidence with which he had dismissed her that afternoon, the careless certainty in his voice, and she thought too of the flicker of genuine uncertainty she had just glimpsed beneath his practiced composure. She did not yet know precisely what his address would contain, or whether her instinct about its flaws would prove correct. But as the musicians began a new piece and the crowd shifted and swelled around her, Elinor felt a quiet, steady anticipation settle over her, the same feeling she used to get as a girl, sitting beside her father's chair, waiting to see whether she could catch the mistake hidden inside a passage before he did. Whatever happened when the Duke rose to deliver his carefully rehearsed words before the assembled court, Elinor intended to be listening very closely indeed. The great hall filled steadily over the next hour, until nearly 200 guests stood clustered beneath the candlelight, their conversations rising and falling like waves against the walls. Elinor moved through the crowd at Cecilia's side. Introduced to a steady stream of names she knew she would struggle to remember by morning. Diplomats from 3 different courts, a bishop with a booming laugh, a countess who spoke 5 languages and seemed delighted to discover that Elinor could follow her rapid shifts between them without missing a beat. It was during this stretch of introductions that Elinor began to understand exactly how significant the evening truly was. This was not simply a private reception among friends and family. Several of the guests belonged to the royal court itself, sent to observe and report back on matters of alliance and influence. The Duke's address, she gathered from overheard fragments of conversation, was meant to honor a visiting delegation and demonstrate, in the most public way possible, the sophistication and learning of the Ashworth family. It was, in short, a performance meant to secure the Duke's standing among people whose opinions mattered a great deal to the future of his family's influence. He has been planning this address since the invitation arrived, Cecilia confided quietly, as they paused near one of the tall windows overlooking the darkened gardens. He wants desperately to impress Lord Camden and the delegation traveling with him. There is talk that Camden's support could matter a great deal when it comes to certain matters before the crown next season. Edmund believes that if he can demonstrate real learning tonight, not just wealth and title, it will set him apart from every other host who has tried to win Camden's favor with nothing more than an excellent dinner. Elinor glanced toward the far end of the room, where a distinguished older gentleman in deep burgundy stood surrounded by a small circle of attentive listeners. This, she understood, must be Lord Camden, and the weight of what was actually at stake in the Duke's carefully rehearsed Latin suddenly settled more heavily upon her. And if his address contains errors, Elinor said slowly, in front of a man like that, with so much depending on the impression he leaves tonight, then it will be rather more than an embarrassing evening, Cecilia finished, her earlier delight tempering slightly into something more thoughtful. I had not considered that when I hoped you might catch him out. I only wanted to see him humbled a little. I did not think of what it might cost him if he stumbled in front of Camden specifically. Elinor felt a small twist of unease at that, the earlier satisfaction of the courtyard confrontation giving way to something more complicated. She had wanted, in some small private corner of her mind, to see the Duke's confidence checked, to watch him discover that carelessness carried consequences. But she had not fully considered that his pride was tangled up with matters far larger than his own vanity, matters that touched his family's future, and by extension, the futures of everyone who depended upon that family, including, now, herself and Cecilia. Perhaps his Latin will prove flawless after all, Elinor said, though she did not entirely believe it, and something in Cecilia's expression suggested she did not believe it either. Perhaps, Cecilia said, though I did hear him through the study door more than once these past weeks, muttering certain phrases over and over, as though he could not quite settle on the correct form. I am no expert, as I have said, but even I noticed a few moments that sounded rather uncertain. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a footman bearing a tray of refreshments, and the two women fell back into the general rhythm of the evening, moving among the guests, exchanging pleasantries, watching the candles burn lower in their holders as the appointed hour for the Duke's address drew closer. Elinor found herself, more than once, glancing toward the Duke across the crowded room. He moved with practiced ease among his guests, laughing at the right moments, inclining his head with appropriate gravity when Lord Camden spoke, and yet Elinor began to notice small signs of tension beneath the polished surface, a slight tightness around his eyes, the way his hand occasionally strayed to the folded pages tucked against his side, as though reassuring himself they were still there, the careful, measured pace of his breathing whenever a lull settled over a conversation, and his attention drifted, however briefly, toward the appointed hour. He is nervous, Elinor realized with some surprise. Beneath all that confidence, he is genuinely nervous about this. The realization softened something in her, though she could not have said exactly why. She had spent the afternoon nursing a quiet grievance against a man who seemed entirely too certain of his own worth. And yet here, watching him navigate a room full of people whose opinions could shape his family's future, she saw for the first time a glimpse of the pressure that certainty was built to conceal. A bell chimed softly somewhere near the entrance, and the murmur of conversation began to still as servants moved through the hall, gently guiding guests toward the chairs arranged in neat rows, facing a small raised platform near the great fireplace. Elinor found a seat beside Cecilia and Lady Margaret, close enough to the front that she would hear every word clearly, and felt her own pulse quicken as the room settled into expectant silence. "He always paces before he speaks," Cecilia whispered, nodding toward a doorway at the side of the hall, where Elinor could just make out the Duke's tall figure moving back and forth in the shadows, his lips moving silently as he reviewed his notes one final time. "Ever since he was a boy giving his first toast at our father's table. He will not admit it, but he frets over these things more than anyone realizes." Elinor watched him a moment longer, and something in his solitary pacing, the careful, private repetition of words meant to sound effortless before an audience, reminded her sharply of her own father in the hours before an important lecture, murmuring Latin conjugations to himself in their small kitchen, insisting he was not nervous at all while his hands trembled slightly around his teacup. The candles along the walls burned steady and bright, casting long shadows across the assembled guests, and somewhere near the front of the hall, Lord Camden settled into his chair with the unhurried patience of a man who had judged 100 speeches before, and expected nothing particularly memorable from this one. The string quartet finished their final piece and lowered their instruments, and a hush fell over the great hall, broken only by the soft rustle of silk and the occasional creak of a chair. Elinor felt Cecilia's hand find hers and give it a brief, nervous squeeze. "Here he comes," Cecilia whispered. The Duke emerged from the side doorway and crossed to the small raised platform with the same easy, confident stride Elinor had watched him use all evening, though she now recognized the careful control beneath it for what it truly was. He unfolded his pages with steady hands, set them on the small lectern before him, and lifted his gaze to survey the assembled guests, his eyes moving briefly, almost imperceptibly, toward Elinor before continuing across the rest of the room. For a moment, silence stretched through the great hall, thick with anticipation. Then the Duke drew a slow breath, squared his shoulders, and began to speak, his voice rich and steady, carrying easily to every corner of the room, the first measured syllables of Latin rolling out into the candle-lit air with all the confidence of a man entirely certain of the ground beneath his feet. Elinor sat forward slightly in her chair, every instinct sharpening to attention, her ear tuned to catch each carefully constructed phrase, waiting, without quite admitting it to herself, to discover whether the confidence in his voice would prove as solid as it sounded. The Duke's voice filled the great hall with practiced confidence as he began his address, the opening lines a formal greeting to his guests, thanking them for honoring his home with their presence, expressing gratitude to the crown for the alliance his family had long enjoyed. His Latin here was clean and correct, the kind of well-worn ceremonial phrasing any competent scholar might have assembled with a good grammar book and enough patience. Elinor found herself relaxing slightly, wondering if perhaps her earlier suspicions had been unfair, born more of wounded pride than genuine concern for accuracy. Then he moved into the heart of his address, and here the true purpose of the evening became clear. He intended to draw a comparison between the long friendship of his family and that of Lord Camden's, weaving in a passage meant to honor the visiting delegation with an elaborate metaphor drawn from classical history, comparing their alliance to the bond between two ancient generals whose combined forces had once secured a famous victory against overwhelming odds. It was, Elinor had to admit, a genuinely clever conceit, the kind of flourish that could have elevated a simple thank you into something memorable, had it been executed with care. It was not executed with care. The first error slipped past almost unnoticed, a minor confusion of case that shifted the meaning of a single clause just slightly askew, turning what should have been praise for Camden's wisdom into something closer to a comment on his caution, a subtly different and rather less flattering quality. Elinor felt her spine straighten, her attention sharpening entirely now, though she said nothing, watching to see whether the mistake was an isolated slip or the first thread of a larger unraveling. It was the latter. As the Duke pressed forward into the elaborate central metaphor, his confidence carrying him through each sentence with unbroken momentum, the errors began to compound. He conjugated a verb incorrectly, turning a statement about the delegation's continued goodwill into something closer to a wish that such goodwill might exist. An unfortunate shift from certainty to doubt in the very sentence meant to reassure his guests of the alliance's strength. A few lines later, he mismatched a noun and its modifying adjective entirely, the resulting phrase nonsensical to anyone truly listening closely, though delivered with such smooth, unbroken confidence that most of the room simply nodded along, charmed by the music of the language rather than troubled by its meaning. Elinor glanced sideways at Lord Camden, whose expression remained politely attentive, though she could not tell whether that was genuine appreciation or simple courtesy from a man who might not follow the Latin closely enough to notice the growing tangle of errors. Beside her, Cecilia had gone very still, her earlier amusement entirely replaced by something closer to genuine worry, her fingers tightening slightly around the fabric of her skirt. The true difficulty came near the climax of the speech. When the Duke reached the central image he had clearly built the entire address around, the comparison of the two ancient generals standing shoulder to shoulder against impossible odds. It was meant to be the emotional heart of the address, the line that would linger in his listeners' minds long after the evening ended, and Elinor could hear in the rising cadence of his voice that he knew it too, that he had rehearsed this particular sentence more than any other, shaping it for maximum effect. But in his eagerness to make the phrase soar, he had reached for a construction beyond his true mastery, an elaborate subjunctive clause meant to convey not merely what the generals had done, but the noble spirit in which they had done it. The grammar collapsed under its own ambition. What he intended to say was something to the effect that the two generals had stood together so that victory might be assured for both their peoples. What he actually said, through a tangle of misapplied endings and a critically misplaced conjunction, suggested instead that the generals had stood together only so that neither might be blamed alone should the battle be lost. It was not a small error. It transformed the entire noble metaphor into something close to an accusation of cowardice, or at the very least, mutual self-interest dressed up as courage. And though the Duke delivered the line with the same rich, confident cadence as everything before it, entirely unaware of what had actually left his mouth, a ripple of confusion passed through the portion of the audience who understood Latin well enough to catch the meaning. A young attaché near the front, exchanged a startled glance with the colleague beside him. Somewhere further back, someone gave a soft, surprised laugh, quickly smothered behind a gloved hand. The Duke faltered. It was barely perceptible at first, a fractional hesitation in his pace, his eyes flicking down to his pages as though seeking reassurance in the words he had written there, though the pages themselves offered no correction, since the error existed only in the gap between what he had intended and what his limited fluency had actually produced. He pressed forward, his voice slightly less steady now, sensing that something had gone wrong without being entirely certain what. A bead of sweat traced a slow path along his temple, catching the candlelight. Elinor felt her chest tighten with a complicated mixture of emotions. The sharp satisfaction of having been proven right about the flaws lurking beneath his confidence, tangled uncomfortably with something closer to genuine sympathy. Watching a man's careful preparation crumble in real time before an audience whose good opinion he desperately needed. She thought again of her father's trembling teacup, the private vulnerability behind every public performance of certainty, and found she could not entirely enjoy the moment she had, in some small way, half hoped for since the courtyard. The Duke stumbled again, this time more visibly, repeating a phrase as though hoping a second attempt might smooth over the confusion, but the repetition only compounded the error, drawing more attention to the muddled grammar rather than less. A few more guests exchanged uncertain glances. Lord Camden's polite attention sharpened into something more focused, his brow creasing slightly as he leaned forward in his chair, clearly beginning to parse through the tangled meaning of what he had just heard. Silence stretched for one long, agonizing moment as the Duke stood frozen at the lectern, his eyes scanning his pages with visible desperation, searching for a path forward that would not require him to acknowledge, in front of 200 watching guests and the very delegation he had hoped to impress, that his carefully rehearsed masterpiece had just collapsed into confused nonsense at its most important moment. It was in that silence, thick with mounting embarrassment and Lord Camden's sharpening scrutiny, that Elinor felt every eye in the room seemed to hover on the edge of a single, unbearable question. Would anyone step forward to help him, or would he be left standing alone at the lectern, drowning in the wreckage of his own overconfidence, in front of everyone whose opinion mattered most? The silence in the great hall had begun to curdle into something uncomfortable, the polite stillness of an audience waiting for a speaker to recover, shifting, second by second, into the more restless unease of an audience beginning to sense a genuine failure unfolding before them. The Duke stood at the lectern, his knuckles pale where they gripped the edges of his pages, his eyes moving rapidly over the words in search of a way forward that would not require him to publicly acknowledge what had just gone wrong. Lord Camden shifted in his seat, exchanging a low murmur with the gentleman beside him, and though Elinor could not hear the words exchanged, she could read the shape of them clearly enough in the faint, unimpressed set of Camden's mouth. Whatever goodwill the Duke had hoped to secure with his elaborate metaphor was rapidly curdling into something closer to quiet disappointment, the very outcome he had feared enough to spend 3 weeks rehearsing against. Elinor felt Cecilia's hand tighten around her own, and beside her, Lady Margaret had gone rigid with tension, her earlier amusement entirely vanished, replaced by the anxious stillness of a woman watching her family's reputation teeter on the edge of public embarrassment. Elinor understood in that moment precisely what Cecilia had understood earlier by the window. This was no longer a small, private satisfaction at seeing an arrogant man humbled. This was a genuine crisis, with real consequences that would ripple outward long after the candles in this hall had burned down to nothing. She thought of her father again, of all the hours he had spent teaching her that knowledge was meant to be used, not simply hoarded as a private point of pride. He had never once, in all his years of teaching, allowed a student to flounder in silence when a gentle word might set them right again. Correction offered with kindness, he had always told her, was one of the truest forms of respect a scholar could give another person, a recognition that their mind was worth the effort of saving from its own mistake. The Duke's voice cracked slightly as he attempted, for a third time, to press forward past the tangled phrase, and this time the words came out even more garbled than before, compounding rather than resolving the confusion. A soft murmur rippled through the crowd, no longer merely surprised, but edging toward something closer to embarrassment on his behalf, the particular discomfort of witnessing someone fail publicly and not knowing quite where to look. Alina rose from her seat. She was not entirely certain, in the instant she did it, precisely what she intended to say, or how she intended to say it without seeming to overstep every boundary of propriety that governed a gathering such as this. She knew only that she could not sit in silence and watch a man drown in a mistake that she, of all the people in that room, possessed the exact knowledge to correct. Whatever grievance she still carried from the courtyard, whatever satisfaction she might have once imagined feeling at this exact moment, dissolved entirely beneath the older, deeper instinct her father had spent a lifetime instilling in her. When you can help someone see clearly, you help them. Anything less is simply cruelty dressed up as pride. Every head in the vicinity turned as she stood, a ripple of surprised attention spreading outward from her seat, and for one suspended moment, Alina felt the full weight of 200 curious eyes settle upon her, including, finally, the startled, searching eyes of the Duke himself, who looked up from his tangled pages with an expression caught somewhere between confusion and desperate hope. "Forgive the interruption, Your Grace," Alina said, and though her heart hammered against her ribs, she was gratified to hear her voice emerge clear and steady, carrying easily across the hushed hall. "I wonder if the difficulty lies in the construction of the final clause. I believe the subjunctive there was intended to express purpose rather than result, which would require a different conjunction entirely. If I understand your meaning correctly, you meant to say that the two generals stood together so that victory might be secured for both their peoples, not merely so that blame might be shared should the battle be lost." A ripple of murmurs swept through the hall, some confused, some suddenly, delightedly comprehending, as several guests who had caught the original error now understood precisely what had gone wrong and precisely how neatly it had just been resolved. Lord Camden's eyebrows rose with genuine interest, his earlier disappointment shifting visibly into something closer to fascination, leaning forward slightly to study the young woman who had just, with a few calm sentences, unraveled a knot that had left a duke stammering before his entire assembled court. The duke stared at Alina for a long moment, and Alina watched a dozen emotions cross his face in rapid succession: shock, and beneath it something rower, the particular vulnerability of a proud man caught utterly unprepared in front of everyone whose opinion he valued most. She held his gaze steadily, offering nothing but calm, patient encouragement, the same expression she would have offered any student caught stumbling over a difficult passage. And slowly, visibly, she watched something in his shoulders ease, some fraction of the desperate tension draining away. "Yes," he said, his voice rough at first, then steadying as he found his footing again. "Yes, precisely that. Forgive me, I believe in my nervousness I lost the thread of the correct construction." He glanced down at his pages, then back up at Alina, and something almost grateful flickered behind his eyes. "Might I trouble you to repeat the correction once more, that I might render it properly?" Alina repeated the phrase slowly and clearly, giving him each word with the same patience she would have offered Cecilia during their first lesson. And the Duke, drawing a breath, spoke the corrected line aloud to the room, this time with the grammar falling cleanly and correctly into place, the noble metaphor finally landing exactly as he had always intended it to. A soft, appreciative murmur rippled through the hall, and several guests, Lord Camden among them, offered small nods of genuine approval, the earlier awkwardness dissolving into something almost warmer than if the speech had gone perfectly from the start, an audience charmed now not merely by polished words, but by the sight of a proud man humbled just enough to accept correction gracefully in front of everyone who mattered most. The Duke continued through the remainder of his address with visibly restored confidence, though a new, quieter humility had crept into his delivery, his eyes flicking briefly toward Alina at two more difficult passages, as though seeking silent reassurance rather than risking another public stumble. She offered small, encouraging nods each time, and though she said nothing further aloud, the exchange passed between them like its own private conversation, invisible to everyone else in the hall but unmistakable to the two of them. When he finally reached the closing lines of his address, thanking his guests once more for their presence and expressing hope for continued friendship between their houses, his voice had regained its full, rich confidence, and the applause that followed was warmer and more genuine than any polite reception could have earned on its own. Lord Camden rose first, clapping with evident sincerity, and the rest of the hall followed, a wave of approval washing over the Duke as he stood at the lectern, flushed with relief and something that looked remarkably like gratitude. Elinor sank back into her seat as the applause continued, her heart still racing, Cecilia gripping her hand so tightly it nearly ached, whispering fierce, delighted praise into her ear that Elinor could barely hear over the ringing in her own ears. She had not planned any of it, had not imagined, standing in the rain that afternoon with her satchel of books clutched to her chest, that by evening she would be standing before the assembled royal court, correcting the very man who had mistaken her for a servant. Across the hall, as the applause finally began to fade and guests rose to mingle once more, the Duke's eyes found hers again, holding her gaze for a long, deliberate moment across the crowded room. And in that look, Elinor read something that had not been present in the courtyard that afternoon, something that looked unmistakably like a man seeing another person clearly for the very first time. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of renewed celebration, the earlier tension dissolving entirely as guests circulated once more among the refreshments, and the string quartet resumed their music, the near disaster of the address already transforming, in the retelling among small clusters of guests, into a charming anecdote about a Duke gracious enough to accept correction in front of his own court. Elinor found herself the subject of considerable curiosity for the remainder of the night, approached by more than a dozen guests eager to learn who the young woman with such precise command of Latin might be, where she had studied, whether she might consider tutoring their own daughters or nieces. She answered each inquiry with as much modesty as she could manage, though the warmth of the attention was difficult to entirely suppress after so many years spent quietly proving her worth to people who rarely thought to ask. Lord Camden himself sought her out at one point, engaging her in a brief but genuinely searching conversation about a particular translation dispute concerning a passage of Tacitus, seeming thoroughly delighted to discover she held a well-reasoned opinion entirely her own, rather than simply repeating whatever her father might have taught her. "Your Grace is fortunate indeed to have secured such a tutor for his sister," Camden remarked to Lady Margaret within Elinor's hearing, as the evening wound toward its close. "I have rarely met a young scholar, man or woman, with such a clear and unaffected command of the language. Tell your nephew I said as much. It is not every host who thinks to surround himself with genuine learning rather than merely the appearance of it." Elinor caught Lady Margaret's small, satisfied smile at that, and felt a warm flush of pride settle beneath her ribs, quieter and steadier than the earlier rush of adrenaline, something closer to simple contentment at having been truly seen. It was nearly an hour later, as the crowd began to thin and carriages rolled up once more to carry departing guests back into the night, that Elinor found herself, quite unexpectedly, alone with the Duke. She had stepped out onto the small stone terrace at the side of the great hall, seeking a few moments of quiet air after the long, overwhelming evening, and had not heard his footsteps approaching until his voice broke the stillness behind her. "Miss Whitmore." She turned to find him standing a respectful distance away, his formal composure from earlier in the evening somewhat softened now, his cravat slightly loosened, his expression carrying none of the guarded confidence she had first encountered in the rain-soaked courtyard. "Your Grace," she said, inclining her head politely, "I hope the remainder of your evening proved successful." "It did," he said, "though I suspect you already know precisely how close it came to being an unmitigated disaster instead." He moved a few steps closer, stopping at a respectful distance beside the stone balustrade, looking out over the darkened gardens rather than directly at her, as though it were easier to speak the next words without meeting her eyes. "I owe you a debt I am not certain I can properly repay, Miss Whitmore. You saved me tonight, in front of the very people whose good opinion I most needed to secure. And you did it after I treated you this afternoon with a carelessness I am frankly ashamed of." Elinor considered her response carefully, aware that this moment, quiet and private after the noise and spectacle of the evening, mattered in a way that the earlier public apology had not quite managed to. "You need not repay anything, Your Grace. I did what any tutor of Latin would do, faced with a grammatical error in need of correction." "Perhaps," he said, finally turning to look at her directly, "though I do not think that is entirely true. I think you might just as easily have stayed silent and let me flounder, and no one in that room would have blamed you for it, given how I treated you earlier. I gave you every reason to let me fail." Elinor held his gaze steadily, choosing her words with care. "I considered it, if I am honest. For one brief moment in the silence after your third attempt, some small part of me thought of the courtyard, and I confess it was tempting to simply watch." A faint, rueful smile touched the corner of his mouth. "I am relieved that whatever better instinct won out." "It was not merely a better instinct," Elinor said. "It was my father's teaching, more than anything in myself. He always told me that true knowledge is meant to serve people, not merely to prove ourselves superior to them. He would have been ashamed of me tonight if I had let pride keep me silent, while a man drowned in a mistake I alone could fix." The Duke was quiet for a moment, studying her with an expression she could not entirely read, something between admiration and genuine reflection. "Your father sounds as though he was a remarkable man." "He was," Elinor said simply. "I lost him this past winter. Coming here to teach your sister is in many ways the only way I have found to keep his life's work continuing in the world." "Then I am doubly grateful you came," the Duke said, "and doubly ashamed of how I greeted you upon your arrival. I have spent a great many years, Miss Whitmore, accustomed to people arranging themselves around my expectations rather than the other way around. It has made me, I think, rather less observant than I ought to be. Tonight has taught me otherwise, in a manner I am not likely to forget any time soon." Elinor allowed herself a small smile at that, some of the day's earlier tension finally easing entirely from her shoulders. "Then perhaps some good has come of the evening beyond simply saving your address." "Perhaps," he agreed, and for a long moment they stood together in comfortable silence on the quiet terrace, the sound of departing carriages and fading music drifting faintly from the great hall behind them, the cool night air carrying the scent of the gardens below. "I should like," the Duke said finally, "if you would permit it, to hear more of your father's teaching sometime. Not merely for the sake of my own Latin, though I confess after tonight I could certainly use the correction, but because I find myself curious about the kind of mind that could raise a daughter with your particular combination of knowledge and grace under pressure, such as I witnessed this evening." "I would be glad to share it, Your Grace," Elinor said, "though I suspect Cecilia will insist upon claiming most of my teaching hours for herself, and rightfully so, given that is precisely why I was brought to this house in the first place." He laughed at that, a genuine, unguarded sound quite unlike the careful composure he had worn all evening, and something in the warmth of it settled easily into the quiet night air between them. "Then I shall simply have to find my own excuses to interrupt her lessons from time to time, and hope you will forgive the intrusion." "I imagine I could find it in myself to forgive a great many things, Your Grace," Elinor said, "provided the coats in question are properly fetched by someone other than myself from this point forward." The Duke's laughter deepened at that, genuine and unrestrained, and Elinor felt her own smile widen in response, the last lingering trace of the afternoon's sting finally dissolving entirely into something closer to easy, hard-won understanding between two people who had begun the day as strangers separated by an unfair assumption, and ended it as something neither of them could yet quite name, but both, in their own quiet way, seemed glad to have found. The weeks that followed the reception settled into a rhythm Elinor could not have imagined when her carriage first rolled up the gravel drive in the rain. Each morning began with lessons in the sunlit study on the eastern side of the house. Cecilia bent eagerly over her Latin primer, working through declensions with a hunger that reminded Elinor, more with each passing day, of her own younger self bent over similar pages at her father's kitchen table. The household staff, once uncertain how to address the young woman who had arrived so unremarkably and departed the reception night as something close to a minor sensation, settled comfortably into treating her with the quiet respect due any valued member of the family's inner circle. News of the evening traveled quickly beyond the walls of Ashworth Hall, as such stories always did among households accustomed to watching one another closely for any sign of advantage or scandal. Within a fortnight, Elinor received 2 additional inquiries from other noble families, hopeful that she might spare some hours to tutor their own daughters, having heard second-hand of the young scholar who had so gracefully rescued a duke's reputation before the assembled royal court. She declined both, gently but firmly, unwilling to divide her attention when Cecilia's education had only just properly begun, though she found a quiet satisfaction in knowing the offers existed at all, proof that her worth was no longer a thing she had to argue for, but something others now simply recognized on sight. The Duke, true to his word on the terrace, found reasons to interrupt Cecilia's lessons rather more often than either woman expected. At first his visits carried the thin pretense of checking on his sister's progress, lingering near the study door for a few minutes before departing again to whatever business awaited him elsewhere in the house. But as the weeks passed, the visits grew longer, the pretenses thinner, until it became an unspoken habit for him to join the final half-hour of each morning's lesson, listening quietly from a chair near the window, while Cecilia worked through her translations, occasionally offering a hesitant attempt of his own at a difficult passage, visibly pleased whenever Elinor's correction came gently rather than sharply. "You have made him rather humble," Lady Margaret remarked to Elinor one afternoon, watching from across the drawing-room as the Duke bent over a page of Ovid with unusual concentration, his brow furrowed in genuine effort rather than the careless confidence Elinor remembered from that first afternoon in the rain. "I confess I did not think it possible. He has been altogether more pleasant to everyone in this household since that evening, staff included. Mrs. Hollis tells me he actually thanked her personally last week for a small matter concerning the wine cellar, which I do not believe has happened in living memory." Elinor smiled at that, watching the Duke mouth a translation silently to himself before venturing it aloud, glancing toward her afterward with the same searching, hopeful expression Cecilia so often wore after a particularly difficult passage. "I think, my lady, that he was always capable of it. He simply had never been given much reason to practice." "Perhaps," Lady Margaret said, studying Elinor with the same shrewd, assessing look she had offered on the night of the reception, "though I suspect it took rather more than reason to bring about such a change. I have known my nephew since he was in short trousers, Miss Whitmore, and I have never once seen him look at anyone the way he has taken to looking at you these past weeks." Elinor felt warmth rise in her cheeks and busied herself gathering a stack of papers rather than answering directly, though she could not entirely deny the truth in the observation. She had noticed it too, in small ways she had tried not to examine too closely, the way his attention lingered a moment longer than necessary during their conversations, the careful thoughtfulness with which he now asked after her opinions rather than simply assuming his own, the quiet ease that had grown between them where once there had been only careless assumption and wounded pride. It came to a head on a mild afternoon in early autumn, several weeks after the reception, when the Duke found Elinor alone in the library, returning a volume of Horace to its shelf after finishing that morning's lesson with Cecilia. He entered quietly, closing the door behind him with a care that suggested he had been waiting for precisely such a private moment, and Elinor turned to find him standing near the entrance, his usual composure visibly gathered around him like armor he had decided, deliberately, to set aside. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I find I have grown rather tired of thanking you formally for what you did that night, as though a single evening of gratitude could properly account for everything that has changed in this house since your arrival. I wonder if you might permit me to simply say, without formality, that knowing you has become one of the genuine pleasures of my life, and I find myself increasingly reluctant to imagine this household without you in it." Elinor set the volume of Horace carefully back on its shelf, buying herself a brief moment to steady the sudden quickening of her own heart before turning fully to face him. "That is a rather significant admission, Your Grace, for a man who once mistook me for kitchen staff." "It is," he agreed, a rueful smile touching his mouth, though his eyes remained earnest, entirely without the guarded confidence that had defined their first encounter. "Though I like to think I have learned, in the months since, to look rather more carefully at the people standing in front of me, and to recognize their worth long before they are ever forced to prove it themselves." Elinor studied him for a long moment, thinking of the rain-soaked courtyard, the careless command that had first brought them together, the trembling uncertainty behind his confident stride toward the lectern, the quiet gratitude in his eyes when her voice had steadied him before the assembled court. She thought of her father, of everything he had taught her about the true purpose of knowledge, and understood, standing in the warm afternoon light of the Ashworth Library, that the true measure of the evening's small triumph had never been about proving the Duke wrong, but about the far quieter, far more lasting victory of two people finally learning to see one another clearly. "I find," she said softly, "that I have grown rather fond of this household myself, Your Grace, and of the people in it." Something in his expression eased entirely at that, warmth spreading unmistakably across his features, and though neither of them spoke further of what precisely lay ahead, an understanding settled quietly between them in the golden autumn light, steady and certain as the turning of a well-translated page. In the months and years that followed, the story of that reception night would be told and retold throughout the county, growing slightly with each retelling the way such stories always do, until eventually few could say for certain exactly how the tutor's quiet correction had first come about, or how a duke's careless mistake in a rain-soaked courtyard had ultimately led him toward the truest partnership of his life. But those who had actually stood in that great candle-lit hall, who had watched a proud man falter before his own ambition and a quiet young woman rise without hesitation to catch him, never forgot the particular hush that had fallen over the room in that single suspended moment, nor the steady, unwavering voice that had broken it, offering not humiliation but grace, and changing, in the space of a single corrected sentence, the entire course of two lives that had very nearly passed each other by, unseen. Winter arrived early that year, dusting the gardens of Ashworth Hall in a fine layer of frost that lingered well into the mornings, and with it came a letter that threatened to unsettle the quiet contentment the household had grown so accustomed to since the autumn. It arrived by private courier, sealed with the mark of the royal court itself, addressed not to the Duke, but to Elinor directly, a fact that startled Mrs. Hollis so thoroughly she carried it upstairs herself rather than trusting it to a footman. The letter came from Lord Camden, and its contents were both an honor and a complication neither Elinor nor Edmund had anticipated. Camden wrote that he had not forgotten the evening of the reception, nor the quiet skill of the young scholar who had so gracefully rescued a stumbling address, and he now found himself in need of precisely such a mind. The Crown was preparing a delegation to travel abroad the following spring, tasked with negotiating a delicate treaty whose language would need to be rendered with exacting precision in Latin, the diplomatic tongue still favored for such formal agreements. Camden requested, with evident sincerity, that Elinor consider joining the delegation's scholarly staff for the duration of the negotiations, an appointment that would carry real influence, real recognition, and a salary far beyond anything a private tutoring position could offer. Elinor read the letter twice in the quiet of the library before showing it to anyone, her mind turning over its implications with the same careful attention she gave any difficult passage of text. It was, she understood immediately, the kind of opportunity her father had always hoped might one day exist for a woman of her training, proof that her scholarship could stand fully in the light rather than remaining confined to a private schoolroom, however beloved that schoolroom had become to her. She found Edmund in his study that evening, the letter still folded carefully in her hand, and watched his expression shift through surprise, pride, and finally something more complicated as she explained its contents. He listened without interrupting, though she could see the effort it cost him to hold his own feelings in check while she spoke. "You must go," he said finally, when she had finished, though the words came slower than his usual easy confidence, weighted with something he was clearly working hard to master. "Camden does not offer such appointments lightly, and you have earned this 100 times over. I would not forgive myself if I let anything, including my own selfish wish to keep you near, stand between you and an opportunity your father would have been so proud to see." "I have not yet decided to accept," Elinor said gently, watching him carefully. "I did not come to you tonight for permission, Edmund. I came because I wanted you to know before I made any decision at all, and because, whatever I choose, I find I do not wish to choose it without first understanding what it might mean for us." Something eased in his shoulders at that, though the careful restraint in his eyes did not entirely vanish. "Then tell me honestly, what is it you want, Elinor, setting aside every consideration of what either of us might lose or gain?" She considered the question seriously, turning it over the way she had been taught to examine any difficult problem, weighing each side with patience rather than haste. "I want to use everything my father taught me, not merely within these walls, however dear they have become to me, but in service of something larger. And I want," she added more quietly, "to build whatever comes next without having to choose between my mind and my heart, as though the two were somehow opposed to one another." Edmund crossed the small distance between them and took her hand, his grip steady and warm. "Then let us find a way to have both. Camden's delegation will need scholars traveling with it, yes, but delegations are not built of solitary appointments alone. There will be need of connections, of hosts willing to receive visiting dignitaries, of a household capable of demonstrating exactly the kind of learning and grace this treaty will require to succeed. I could accompany you, Elinor, not as your keeper, but as your partner in the endeavor if you would have me." Elinor felt something loosen in her chest that she had not fully realized she'd been holding tense since the letter first arrived. A fear she had not quite named even to herself, that advancement and love might prove, in the end, impossible to hold together in the same two hands. "You would leave Ashworth Hall for months, perhaps longer, on the strength of my appointment rather than your own ambitions." "I would leave 100 halls for the chance to watch you do the work you were born to do, and to stand beside you while you do it," he said simply. "I spent the first 8 years of my dukedom believing that my worth lay in being obeyed without question. You have taught me this past year that it lies instead in learning to see clearly, and in choosing, deliberately, whose voice deserves to stand equal to my own. I do not intend to unlearn that lesson now, when it matters more than it ever has before." Elinor wrote her acceptance to Lord Camden the following morning, and by the time spring arrived, carrying with it the first green shoots along the gravel drive where her carriage had once stopped in the pouring rain, the household of Ashworth Hall had begun preparing for a journey neither the Duke nor his once mistaken tutor could have imagined on that first uncertain afternoon. Cecilia, though sorry to lose her tutor's daily presence, had grown skilled enough in her studies to continue her progress through correspondence, exchanging long letters filled with translated passages and eager questions that Elinor promised faithfully to answer from wherever the delegation's travels carried her. Lady Margaret, for her part, declared herself thoroughly satisfied with how the whole affair had unfolded, though she could not resist reminding anyone who would listen that she had predicted an interesting outcome from the very first evening, and had rarely, in her considerable years, been so pleased to be proven right. On the morning of their departure, Elinor stood once more in the courtyard where it had all begun, though this time the sky above Ashworth Hall was clear and bright, and she wore not a plain traveling dress but a coat of fine wool, tailored specifically for the journey ahead, a small leather case of translated documents tucked beneath one arm rather than a satchel of borrowed books. Edmund waited beside the carriage, offering his hand to help her inside, and as she settled into her seat and looked back at the great stone house rising behind them, she thought of the rain-soaked stranger who had once stood exactly here, dismissed and unseen, uncertain of her place in a world that had not yet learned to recognize her worth. That woman, she understood now, had never truly needed the world's permission at all, only the patience to wait until the world caught up to what she had always known to be true about herself. As the carriage rolled forward down the long gravel drive, carrying her toward a future built equally of scholarship and partnership, of a mind finally free to work in the open light of day, Eleanor Whitmore did not look back again. She looked only forward, toward everything still waiting to be translated, corrected, and understood, one carefully chosen word at a time.